The scripture is from Matthew 1, verses 1 to 12. I'm sorry, Matthew 5. Thank you. My wife is on the ball. Normally called the Beatitudes. Now when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. And his disciples came to him, and he began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. May God bless to our understanding, and hence to our everyday living, the message found in these words. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing and acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. The Montgomery bus boycott began in December 1955, 68 years ago. Those who were 10 years old then are now 78. All who remember that event are fewer and fewer each passing year. Now it is difficult to describe how black and white people lived in those days. The nation was radically divided along racial lines, very similar to the apartheid system in South Africa that lasted from 1948 to 1991, 43 years in total, as compared to 424 years in the United States. Both countries were radically divided according to the racist principle that placed white people at the top of the social, economic, and political order, and black people at the bottom. Restaurants, hotels, businesses, schools, colleges, courthouses, hospitals, public parks, swimming pools, residential areas, marriages, theaters, recreational centers, sports arenas, the professions, trade unions, buses, trains, the military, public bathrooms, water fountains, churches, graveyards, and much more were all racially segregated. Most important, blacks knew their place and remained in it, lest they invoke the onslaught of terror that would surely befall them with impunity. A few white-collar jobs were available to blacks only in black communities, and they were limited to school teachers, preachers, and a few doctors and nurses in the area. And incidentally, blacks were called Negroes or coloreds up until the 1960s, 1970s, when they took control of their own collective identity by calling themselves either black or African American. In short, for many generations, they feared the wrath of whites, who viewed all blacks as inferior to whites in every possible way. And ever since 1867, the Ku Klux Klan kept its racist terror alive by the drama of white hooded members regularly riding through the black community in the dead of night, bent on lynching some defenseless black person. And so on August the 28th, 1955, the 14-year-old Emmett Till, on vacation from Chicago, was abducted by the Ku Klux Klan from his grandparents' home in Money, Mississippi, was tortured, shot in the head, and dumped in the Tallahatchie River. He was accused of speaking inappropriately to a white woman as a female clerk in a store. In September of that year, an all-white jury found the two men who killed him not guilty. The men later admitted their guilt in a story that they sold for $4,000 to a Look magazine reporter. Within the systemic confines of such societal restraints, blacks had carved out a separate world of their own by forming their own churches, which in turn launched various social services, such as schools, mutual aid societies, men, women, and children's organizations, leadership training activities, talent shows, collective saving for funeral expenses, and much more. Most important, they kept hope alive for a better day by trusting in the Lord, whom they always believed was on their side, because the Jesus they served had been the friend of the weak, the downtrodden, the widows, women, children, the sick, the blind, the stranger, and the helpless. And like them, he was the victim of abuse and torture before being killed by those who enjoyed the official support of the state. In those days, throughout the South, blacks who rode the public buses had to board the bus at the front, purchase a ticket, and then get off the bus and go to the back and board the bus again and sit at the back. Often the bus driver would drive away before they were able to get to the back of the bus to reboard. And further, when the seats reserved for whites were filled, blacks were required to give up their seats for the whites. And so on December the 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man, she became the spark that ignited the 20th century civil rights movement, that marked the beginning of a revolutionary change in race relations throughout the nation. For the first time in their long, bitter history of discrimination and segregation, blacks took the initiative in publicly protesting segregation on the public buses. Never before had they directly confronted the power structure in any southern city. And at first they did not know whether or not they would gain the support of the black community in Montgomery, to say nothing about the wider community beyond the city's limits. And consequently, they were all greatly surprised on that first morning to see the empty buses. And when the official declaration of a bus boycott, or with the official declaration of a bus boycott, blacks organized the Montgomery Improvement Association and elected 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. as pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church as its first president. At first, they did not call for the desegregation of the buses, but merely that the bus drivers be more respectful of the blacks on the buses. And they called for the employment of black drivers on the buses in black areas in order to ensure a measure of respect. The boycott lasted for 381 days and ended with the United States Supreme Court declaring segregation on public buses as illegal. That success constituted the launching pad for desegregation throughout the South, a movement that endured for the next decade when President Lyndon Johnson finally signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voters' Rights Act of 1965, and the Open Housing Act of 1968. Now, what makes this a sermon rather than a history lecture is my declaration that the civil rights movement was both theological and political in the means it utilized, in its context, and in which it operated, and the goal it sought. All of the mass meetings were held in the city's black churches, and as the organization expanded its goal to desegregate the entire South, its name was changed in 1957 from the Montgomery Improvement Association to the Southern Christian Leadership Council. Both organizations fully embrace Mohandas Gandhi's principle of nonviolent resistance as the means employed in all their public actions. And Dr. King regularly spoke about that principle as the social expression of the so-called Golden Rule. Love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and your neighbor as yourself. And thus he concluded that while Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence provided the movement with its method, the New Testament provided the movement with its inspiration. He further said that nonviolent resistance is the public expression of love, and love applies to everything, including our enemies. And thus love's goal is reconciliation. Loving one's enemy means seeking all possible means to become reconciled to one's enemy. And thus love does not resist violence, but with violence, but rather absorbs the violence through non-violent response. Love, by doing so, is not passive, but is active. It is actively engaged in resisting, but doing so non-violently. A response that never humiliates one's enemy, but always paves the way for reconciliation. And that was the practice that both Jesus and Gandhi exemplified in all of their public actions. They believed that loving the enemy would have a corresponding reciprocal effect. Shortly after the bus boycott began, Dr. King was informed at a meeting that his house had been bombed, with his wife and infant daughter at home. Fortunately, they were not hurt, because they were at the back of the house, and the bomb was set off at the front of the house. King then demonstrated his commitment to nonviolence by telling the gathered crowd to go home and not think about retaliation. He reminded them that violence only begets violence, and surprisingly to us, they all went home. Throughout the 13-month boycott and the subsequent years of the Southern protests, blacks were never accused of employing violence. Yet they were jailed by the hundreds for non-violently protesting against the unjust laws of racial segregation, trusting that the non-violent resistance of Jesus and Gandhi would win the battle. It was a life and death struggle, and over the space of a decade, 40 civil rights fighters were killed in the struggle, and countless numbers survived brutal beatings, including the iconic Congressman John L. Lewis, who was brutally beat in 1965 while marching with Dr. King across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. And at the 50th anniversary of which was celebrated in 2015 with President Barack Obama at a reenactment of the march. A year before that event, the sharecropper Fannie Lou Hamer, having survived a brutal beating in prison herself for trying to vote in Mississippi, she bore wounds from that beating as she would take with her to her grave. And as the leader of the newly formed Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, she delivered a deeply moving speech before the Credentials Committee of the National Democratic Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey, opposing the seating of the all-white Mississippi delegation, which had refused to allow blacks to vote in their primary election. During the 10 years of struggle, Dr. King was arrested and put in jail 29 times for his role of leading the nonviolent resistance movement. And like Jesus of Nazareth and Mohandas Gandhi in India, he refused to remain silent in the presence of injustice. He believed that to do so would be tantamount to consenting to violence, which in turn would imply aiding and abetting the violence. After Dr. King won the Nobel Prize in 1964, the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, his wife asked him to save a portion of the prize for his children's education, and instead he contributed all of it to the movement. Clearly, his actions inspired countless others to join the movement, including many whites, 6 of whom were brutally killed. It is important to add, however, that he inspired at least 2 notable closeted gay black men to embrace the cause, namely the iconic Bayard Rustin, a brilliant strategist who behind the scenes oversaw the organization of the 1965 March on Washington for freedom and jobs, and the acclaimed novelist James Baldwin, who chose to forsake his self-imposed asylum in Paris and return to his native country to do whatever he could in the civil rights movement. Alas, one of the saddest episodes in that long, bitter campaign was the Sunday morning bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham that killed 4 little girls at Sunday school, a tragedy that shocked the entire nation. It occurred only 18 days after the historic March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 28, 1962. Dr. King always knew that he would be assassinated one day because of his actions. But like both Jesus and Gandhi, that thought did not deter him. Since the day after his assassination was Good Friday, many began linking his death with that of Jesus. Both were victims of violence despite their commitment to nonviolence. Yet both challenged the powers of the state by advocating an alternative way of life for all of God's children, based on justice and love. And like Jesus, Dr. King was persecuted for the sake of righteousness. And yet his followers continued to link their arms and sing, "We shall overcome someday." On April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before his death, Dr. King broke his silence on the war in Vietnam and linked the civil rights movement with the anti-war endeavor. His speech was entitled, "A Time to Break Silence." It was more of a sermon than an ordinary speech. It angered many in his own movement, and many of the leaders in the movement were opposed, and was widely criticized by the leading newspapers in the nation, including the prominent black newspaper, the Chicago Defender. And in that speech, he stated unequivocally that the 3 major evils that prevented America from realizing its ideals were racism, militarism, and poverty, each of which being a form of the nation's violence against defenseless people. And like Jesus and Gandhi, Dr. King was persecuted and killed for the sake of righteousness. And now is the time for you to share some of your thoughts on this matter of working for righteousness, working for justice, in the spirit of love and nonviolent resistance. The floor is open for you now. Yes.
Thank you very much, Peter. There's a lot there. One, for reminding me, I think I knew this, that the SCLC came out of the Montgomery Improvement. I don't.
Association.
Yeah, I didn't have that in my mind. But the thing that hit me for the first time is it not true that that young woman admitted later that she lied? And Matilda's accuser? I think she admitted it, that she had lied. And so what came to me was, in doing that, she must have asked God for forgiveness, and the God we know would have forgiven her. But if it was only before she died, did she ever talk to his mom and say, I'm sorry? And then if it had been our son and she had done that, would we have been able to forgive her? I mean, that's what.
Well, thank you. Everybody has heard this, right? Because it's going to be virtual as well? Yes. I think you might be confusing two stories. The killing of Mockingbird, I think, is where the story where the woman had lied. The woman, you're talking about the Emmett Till?
Yeah, I thought she said she lied.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, she admitted she lied.
Okay, I'm not aware of that.
We'll look it up.
Okay.
Yeah, assuming that, okay, if she lied, she knew from the beginning, and how that shaped her life as she went through whatever the process was, where she asked for forgiveness, and I'm assuming she must have, and finally, how did that shape her life? And I mean, let's face it, she was a person that local people knew who she was, based on the kinds of things you're saying. While I'm sure there were some whites who weren't pleased about it, there were others who probably didn't care. But, the black community probably never really felt good about her. So.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry.
Okay.
But I'm just saying. You can't speak to this. Yeah, you can't speak to it, but I'm just saying in terms of the fact that I believe she probably, if she said she lied, she probably asked God for forgiveness.
Yeah.
At some point.
Well, okay. I have no way of knowing that. I've not heard that story about that particular case about Emmett Till. So, okay. Next.
I liked how you early on said, and I forget what it was, but it said, so if somebody was 10 years old, then they'd be, because I think we forget how recent all of this was. In fact, I'm like, I should ask my parents who were in their 80s now, what they remember about living through that time. Basically untouched because of, having the privilege of being white in the North. And the courage, it just hits me knowing, Martin Luther King and others knowing that there would be casualties, including themselves. to continue to push, and I love the definition of love, the act of absorbing the violence or absorbing the abuse. I mean, that is such a hard concept to get your head around, and yet that what drove the movement. And then I've thought, like, why haven't more people replicated that in more recent years? Because it was effective in changing things, the nonviolent approach. There are incidents of it. It just doesn't seem to be maybe as organized, or there doesn't seem to be as charismatic a leader as Martin Luther King, or I don't know. I'm rambling. Anyway, those were my thoughts. Thank you for your.
Thank you.
Head around it. It's hard for me to get my head around. I mean, what you said, Peter, as far as, I mean, we know the non-violent protesting paid off. It paid off because we're here now. But 40 people, you said 40 leaders lost their lives?
40 people.
Yeah, so they didn't get to see it pay off. But they stuck with it, and the people around them. And that's just amazing.
In Montgomery, there's a nice monument there with the 40 names on it in front of the Southern Law and Poverty Center. It paid off at a great expense. And don't forget the hundreds and hundreds of people who carry wounds to the grave with them. And that this phenomenon was more intense in the southern states, but it was a national phenomenon that pervaded the United States, unfortunately. But yet many of the people who migrated from the South from 1914, the First World War, onwards to the 1960s and so forth, the great migration within the country was a matter of escaping the intensity of the racial segregation for less intense experience in the North. But even in the 1960s, when I first came to this country in 1965, to Chicago, there were many, many dimensions of life in Chicago that blacks could not participate in. And there was a major set of school demonstrations for better conditions for the segregated schools in the cities of Chicago. That was going on, and when I came in 1965, went on for several years, and it was that out of that protests against the schools that a coalition of community organizations invited Dr. King to bring the Southern movement to Chicago, which he did in 1968. And I had the privilege to be there to observe what happened in 68 to a certain extent. And that was very, very bloody as well. Because whenever demonstrations, peaceful, nonviolent demonstrations took place, they were surrounded by angry, hostile violence from white protesters, white combatants.
But the thing, I mean, in groups in the thousands of people, I have to imagine that there were people in that organization that probably at times spoke to Martin Luther King and the other leaders, and they were getting frustrated, I'm sure, and there were times where they were angry and they wanted to get violent or get aggressive, and that they were that as a group, as the leaders, they were able to kind of refocus and say that's not going to work.
Yeah.
But how in that minute to continue to, in all those minutes, hours, to not do that is just amazing.
Let's not forget that blacks were not instinctively nonviolent. Andrew Young, who became eventually under President Carter, the representative to the United Nations, his job was really to police the gathering demonstrators, to make sure that they had no weapons whatsoever, that they had all signed the pledge of being nonviolent, that they would not strike back and so forth, told them to leave the demonstration if they couldn't do this. And many of them did leave the demonstration because they couldn't do it. And many didn't join the demonstration because they said they were not nonviolent themselves. Somebody hits them, they're going to hit them back, and so forth. The people were told not to throw bricks back at the people, and so forth. But you had to police that, and you had to have workshops to role play this whole business before the demonstrations in order to inculcate in people the commitment to nonviolence. It was a difficult thing, but the idea was it would change you in the process, and people would resist that particular change. And many people didn't participate because they just couldn't commit themselves to nonviolence, which is a very, very difficult thing to commit oneself to.
Thank you, Peter. I was thinking about, well, I'm old enough to remember.
Is that right?
Yes, I am. I'm old enough to remember all of these things, and I especially remembered the 4 little girls that were killed in that bombing. And what I thought about for many years after that was, how did those parents and family members and church members deal with that afterward? And they dealt with it with no violence. I remember that my son was born the day after that happened.
Is that right?
Yeah. And as I was reading and thinking about it, even way back then, I remember they didn't respond with violence any more than the people in the church that were killed by that, that were in their prayer meeting and were killed by that man that came in and sat down with them. And yeah, and so it shows that the church, or at least the belief in God, had a big impact on the way people responded. Yeah. And Martin Luther King brought that to many people for many years. In his short lifetime, he gave an awful lot to let people know what Jesus was about and what his love was about and what justice and mercy meant. So.
Yes, well, that's very good. It's very true. The children, they were students largely, who formed the ranks of the demonstrations because people who had jobs and the parents and so forth were afraid to participate in many ways because they would lose their jobs, and they couldn't afford to go to church, go to jail, whereas the kids had nothing to lose, and the parents often mortgaged their homes in order to get money to bail the children out, and so there was a reciprocal connection there between the parents and the children. And you know, the young adults. But so much of the movement depended upon the young people who had no properties, had no jobs. They were students, and they were the backbone of the demonstrations. And then the black clergy, even the large numbers of black clergy, didn't participate in the demonstrations, because they were afraid for various reasons. Many churches, I went to look up how many churches were bombed. There were hundreds of churches throughout the South that were bombed and destroyed because they were seen as the locus for the demonstrations. Yeah. Yes, I mean, yeah, they're bombed and burned, exactly. Yeah.
One quick comment, Peter.
Yeah.
I was a mere infant at the time, but can't tell it now. There was a story on the news, and I with my walker. I couldn't get in to hear the whole thing this week, but I asked my dog what it was about, and she couldn't tell me. But the last thing I got, there's a new monument made of Martin Luther King and his wife, and there were many entries to who was going to make it, but the winner, it was just the hands of Martin Luther King and his wife. And it's beautiful, but they picked it because his wife never got enough credit for supporting him. And it's the most beautiful image of just Martin Luther King and his wife, giving her hands to support him through his whole process of what he did for his dream. And it's gorgeous if anybody wants to Google it, but just wanted to give that image. But thank you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much for introducing his wife, Coretta Scott King, who played an enormously important role.
Yes, she did, and she
in
never
the
got
movement.
enough credit for it. But
Exactly.
this last statue says it all, and I don't even know where it's going to be. My dog wouldn't tell me, but it's gorgeous. Yes. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't Google it, but thank you.
And the movement had its own problems with women in the movement, and there's several books have been written about that by black women themselves and so forth, where women were not able to assume strong leadership roles. One of the reasons why the young people broke away in many ways to support the movement, but to have their own movement, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Council, which was led by a woman again, Ella Baker, who had been the executive secretary at LCLC. But she told the young people that really you got to pull yourself away from these old clergy and so forth, because they are not going to let you express yourselves, have leadership roles any more than they would allow women to have leadership roles. So that's a whole story in itself. And yeah, okay.
We learned so much from you, Peter.
Yeah, well, it's so that was great. Where the role of women, the role of young people, and how they negotiated all of that, and the role of people of the queer population as well. That's another phenomenon that needs to be looked at more carefully as well. I simply touched just touched the surface of that by referring to Bayard Rustin and James Baldwin as two of the iconic figures in the movement, but there were many, many more, including women as well.
What I wanted to just
Oh, my wife again.
what has come to me as you're talking about the nonviolence and what people endured was the fact that as a result of this, we got both the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and if there had been violence, I don't think those things would have come about.
Well, they came about, ironically, because of the violence of the killing of John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, but
And I mean, that was one of the reasons why Lyndon Johnson, who was a Southerner himself and a staunch, segregationist for a good deal of his life.
right.
But it's ironic that he was the president who decided to do the correct political thing at that time.
Right.
Yes.
But I'm saying it wasn't violence on the part of the movement. It was,
yeah.
they were not, and I'm saying if they had been violent, I'm not sure those things could have happened. And it's interesting because, when you talk about the other side, I mean, there was Malcolm X, and there was later on, the Black Panthers, so that some of the nonviolent folks did come to the fore. Of course, the Black Panthers were after Martin Luther King. So,
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Peter. That was a lively and informative and difficult conversation to have, but